Okay, take it away, Maria.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Rebecca. And welcome everybody along. I hope I can share with you some really interesting information this afternoon. And it'll be a little bit different because it's not just about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples or people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. It's actually a lot more about you. So look, my name is Maria Raciti and I'm an Aboriginal woman. I'm a descendant of the Kalkadoon Bankwith Walgaman peoples. I'm a professor of marketing up here at University of the Sunshine Coast, and I'm also one of the directors of the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre. We were very thrilled. Our research centre just kicked off last year after about 7 years of incubation, so we're just getting going. My main area in social marketing in particular is around educational inequality, but what I'm going to share with you today is around this idea of culturally sensitive health service design, and talk to you a little bit more about how identity is a really key part of that and some of the key attributes when coming up with a service design that's going to be used for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and just and really took also a little bit about an ethics approach to that too. I do have the chat open, so do feel free to pop anything in the chat as we go along. I've just got a notice on my meeting. I'll just get this right. So what I'm going to cover today is basically talking about how when you're working with people at the margins or marginalised groups, you are working with people who have experienced compounding and intergenerational disadvantage, and this requires sensitivity. You yourself may have experienced trauma in your own life, and what happens when we're working with people at the margins, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, is you've got trauma that's occurred over generation after generation after generation as a result of colonisation in Australia, just as it is in other countries as well. So in Australia, there were still some government policies up to the 70s that saw Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's self-determination limited, in that they could not determine their own future, or we could not determine our own future. So I will talk in first person because I am an Aboriginal person. Now, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, or the acronym CALD, culturally and linguistically diverse people, often experience health inequities. It's important though to remember that just because a group experiences these inequities, it's not every person within that group. So towards the end of the presentation today, I'll talk a little bit about vulnerability and the fact that we have to be careful with assumptions about people in these groups. Now, what you guys, what I understand you're doing is you're coming up with service design. And what we need to do when you're coming up with service design for marginalised groups or people at the margins. Now, look, no matter what term I use, it's always going to be politically charged. So you will notice I'll jump between those terms. So for people at the margins or marginalised groups, it's important that services are co-created. Now, that's just a foundational sort of principle of service design these days, but it's absolutely critical in these instances because it's about self-determination. It's about you helping others to achieve their goals and aspirations and elevate their health. So co-created service design is strengths-based. And what that means is you work with people where they're at, you focus on what they can do, and then you take that and leverage it to actually accelerate their health outcomes, okay? So also these types of services are participatory. They're very much about conversation. And a part of conversation is also listening, particularly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's deep listening. It's actually a spiritual practice. It's actually a really important part. And you'll often find that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will listen. That's because we have an oral history. Our histories were passed through generations, through story, through song. So that's how come you'll notice that people will listen a lot more before they speak. So these are really important. Now, a big part of I've got there on that third point is it's about enabling self-empowerment and self-determination. Absolutely key. As I mentioned, colonisation in this country meant that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for a very, very long time lived under political regulations and actual legislation that prevented their freedom, okay, and freedom of movement. So things, for example, like exemption, the certificate of exemption, which meant that if a person wanted to leave one of the established Aboriginal missions where literally people were rounded up and cattle trucks and put onto these, forced taken off their land and put on these missions, they had to sign a legal document that relinquished their Aboriginality, which is called the certificate of exemption. So just imagine that. Imagine if someone legally came up to you and said, you can leave this this place, but you have to sign a form that relinquishes your ethnicity. So that's just one example of it. And as I mentioned, the Act was all the way up until the 1970s. I should give you a little bit of background on myself. My grandparents were well-known Aboriginal activists in this country, and they pushed very hard against the Act, and they were involved with the federal government and the state government, and were actually a very big part of self-determination practices in Queensland. Yes, they've got streets and parks and whatnot named after them. And my grandmother was one of the first people who set up with the Prime Minister and Cabinet's office around women's shelters. So this is a really key part here, is that you understanding that you're working with a group of people who have a whole heap of strengths. They're bringing stuff with them and resilience. And it's about harnessing that resilience to help them to move forward in their goals and aspirations. Respectful engagement is absolutely key part of this too. So remember, it's about knowledge exchange. Now, I won't get too deep in it, but basically there's different types of knowledge systems that we all have. And for those of you who are part of the Zoom today, who are from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds, you bring with you a whole heap of what they call cultural capital that's often not valued by the dominant culture, but you have it with you. It's a strength that you have. For example, those kinship and family connections that keep culturally and linguistically diverse as well as Indigenous people strong, is that connection. One of the other connections for Indigenous people is the connection to country, which I'll talk about. But this respectful engagement is about understanding that there are different knowledge systems. There's the knowledge system of the dominant Western culture, and it's actually the dominant Northern Western culture. It's the reason why we celebrate Christmas with snow and Santa Claus, is because we've actually just inculcated the dominant Northern Hemisphere's Western culture. So one of the things here is understanding that there's different knowledge systems. I have been sort of, I guess, immersed within the dominant knowledge system, but it's about understanding that there's other ones there, and it's about respectfully engaging with those. And it's about sensitivity. Now, this sensitivity really is about you understanding yourself first, because what you bring to your service design, and you may not realize it, is you bring a micro history. You bring conscious and unconscious biases about how you see the world, your worldview. It's called epistemology, but I'll just use the worldview as a easier term. And what it means is that as a social marketer or as a health professional, basically as any professional, you've got privilege and power, and it's about understanding what that is, okay, and how that finds its way into your service design. You'll notice I talk a lot with my hands if you're looking at the video. Bad habit. Now, look, identity is complicated, and you've probably been through this yourself. Identity, it can be messy, and in fact, we have multiple identities. That's really sort of the thinking of present, and has been for most of the 21st century. Identity is very complicated, and then when you get into ethnicity, then it becomes even more complicated. You've got fractured histories. You've got in Australia, for example, stolen generations where children were literally taken from their parents, never to be seen again, given different names and growing up in different areas, and then find out later in life that they're Indigenous and trying to search back. But there's no ancestry.com for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, just put it that way. So just imagine that sort of trying to go backwards. So identity is complicated. Ethnic identity can be messy. And I'm sure some of you in the Zoom can relate to that as well. There seems to still be this view that should only be one thing. And obviously, as you know, ethnic diversity is more, we're more ethnically diverse population than at any other point in history. So what you guys are coming up with, as I understand, is a human-centered service design. Now, I put the human part in there because you'll see in a couple of slides, I'll talk about an ethics approach. Now, it starts with you. Now, you'll notice down the bottom, I've got the letter U in brackets. Now, often what happens is in other discipline areas such as social work and psychology, they go through this process of working with the people who are implementing the programs to unbracket themselves. What bracketing means is sometimes when we're working on a project, we put our own history and our own privilege and power to one side, and we deal with a group of people at arm's length. What this means is that we're not acknowledging how our own history, our own worldview actually seeps, it percolates into our design. And what it means is that we're not recognizing the unconscious and sometimes conscious biases that we have. So when you're designing a service for other people, you have to consider yourself first, and you have to understand where you fit and how these power imbalances and privileges that you have are. And look, frankly, just knowing who you are is a really great professional skill, and it will help you in the long run. So I've called it micro history there because our histories are over generations, but it's basically about your life course, because times change and the world you experience may be different to that your parents have or previous generations. Now, one way of looking at identity has actually come from feminist research, and it's called intersectionality. So some of you may have heard of this before. Intersectionality is a way at looking at different attributes that people have. And as you can see on this slide here, there's a line in the middle that says domination. Now, intersectionality is basically saying that we are comprised of multiple identities, and you are female or male, for example, or what your sexual preference is, will all parts of who we are. We're made up of lots of different dimensions. So what intersectionality does is it identifies and it actually acknowledges that we're all these different things. Okay, and so this is a really great graphic that I got. As you can see, it comes from the educational inequality literature, but it's actually used quite broadly across many, many disciplines, including social work and psychology. So have a look at this and you can see this line of domination. What this basically says is that there's some characteristics that people have that have been given greater value by the dominant culture. That means they've been given privilege. And those privileges means that they can move through their lives and days with fewer barriers, fewer hassles, and fewer sort of restrictions around themselves. So hopefully you're having a little bit of a look at this slide there and starting to consider where you are. One of the concerns, personal concerns I've had, and I raised it in a presentation I did recently, was my concern is sometimes that people in social marketing or people who are designing programs for others sit above the line, sit in privilege and don't realize that. And the concern is that those below the line are the ones that we're focusing a lot on. And that's a bit of a, there's a bigger issue that sits around that. But hopefully if you've had a look at that, you might be able to say, okay, which of these attributes do you have and where do you sit? But understanding that you are many things, many attributes, and understanding that these things create privilege for you and create an easier life, the good life for you, is really key. Now, some of you too, I know, will be experiencing some of the attributes underneath as well as I do. So now you'll notice I've italicized two words here. So probably the key thing is to, even if it's the only thing you remember from today, is to remember that Indigenous research is by Indigenous people, with Indigenous people, and for Indigenous people. It's not about Indigenous people, and it's certainly not about you. What this is all about is that this is sort of this fundamental philosophy that you'll find in Indigenous studies research, and it's widely accepted across many institutions in our society. So as I've got there, when you're working with and for Aboriginal people, and that's really key because it positions you as a facilitator, as a helper, as a co-creator, not as the dominant person, not as the holder of all knowledge, not as the person who knows better, but as the partner. So when you're working with and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and CALD people, your service design should do no more harm. Really key because, as I mentioned before, intergenerational trauma has happened. These people, us, are experiencing these types of harms and microaggressions on a daily basis. So when you come up with a service, the idea is not just to do no harm, but to do no more harm. So understanding the histories, I guess, and where people are coming from. As I've got there in the bottom, it's about avoiding this notion of othering and seeing yourself as separate, or as there's us and there's the others. It's actually a really interesting way that we often in professional practice position ourselves, where we see the people we work with as others. And it's also about acknowledging, for those of you who are part of the dominant culture, and recognizing the limits of your historical knowledge and life experiences. Often when we design services, we're working with groups of people that we don't have a lived experience with or of. So empathy is absolutely key. And it's very much this sense of self-awareness. You don't know everything that's happened perhaps in Aboriginal history in Australia, and you're not necessarily aware of the experiences of first or second generation migrants in Australia. So it's really being conscious of those boundaries to what you do know and what you don't know. And a lot of it's about approaching things with an open mind and also about approaching things with an open heart, which is an ethics of care. So an ethics of care is really key. It's something that's just starting to, it's very prominent in other literatures. It's starting to arise in some marketing and social marketing literature. But very much this care ethics or ethics of care approach is, as it's got there in the bottom, looking at yourself or positioning yourself as someone who works with and for Aboriginal people as a co-designer. You're exchanging knowledge, you're exchanging what you know with what they know of equal merit. Each knowledge system is of equal merit. And the participants, so you're exchanging that knowledge with the participants so that you can leverage the strengths of those participants so that they can achieve their aspirations and hope. A lot of what we do in service design and human design is about giving people hope and helping them to achieve what they want. Care ethics is about genuine heart human connection, okay, wanting to do the right thing and wanting to do good, and the reward within it. It's not just about finishing a project or getting some materials together. It's actually about ensuring that what you're doing does no more harm and helps people. Now, it's a little bit fuzzy, this image, but there's an article there where they talk about an ethics of care, and they break it down into these sorts of things. Caring about other people. So when you're with your participants, that active listening, absolutely critical. There's some work, actually the Australian of the Year, recent Indigenous Australian of the Year, Miriam, and I just forgot her last name, she put together an area called Didari, which is about Indigenous listening practices. And there's some great videos on it on YouTube. I'll send them through to Rebecca later on. So it's caring about people, it's caring for them, it's about giving to, and that giving part, as it's got there, is about recognition of their strengths and attributes, what they bring to the table, and acknowledgement of their life experiences, traumas, and others that they have had. Care receiving is about that reflexivity. This is you reflecting on that experience. So you've had a meeting with some participants or clients, reflecting on not only what was said and how that's going to influence, but yourself, how that influenced you as a person, and how that might change your worldview. And of course, caring with. Now, one of the things we often read about is this notion of cultural competency. And I've put this together here. I just wanted to show you that there is actually a continuum of when you're working with people from diverse backgrounds, it's important, as I said, to acknowledge your own limitations, what you know, what you don't, and how your microhistory has influenced your worldview, but also to be aware that we evolve and grow. So looking at this, you can see that there's this spectrum. Most people typically in universities sit in the cultural blind and outside sit in the cultural blindness spot, that yellow one in the middle, and tend to be of this very egalitarian, particularly Australia view, that treat everybody the same, but only meet the needs of the dominant group. What I wanted to show you this is that you'll often see the word cultural competency, but what we're really aiming for is this next level one up there, proficiency. Proficiency is about implementing those changes that are based on cultural needs. Okay, absolutely critical. So there's a level above, and that's what I'd love you all to try to transcend to over your careers. Now, I'll just give you a bit of a background on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples comprise 2.8% of the population, so around 800,000 in the Australian population. It tends to be a much younger population. The vast majority of the population is actually under the age of 15. Okay, which is very key. Indigenous people are incredibly diverse, and that's because of those fractured histories. That's because of colonisation practices such as stolen generations, such as creating missions, such as I mentioned before, certificates of exemption and things like that. So as a result, when you meet this, be careful not to stereotype, really is probably what I'm saying. Meet people where they're at. Be genuine and accepting of where people are in their experiences. Not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have grown up on country or in culture. Okay, so that creates internal tensions within, particularly if you as a researcher or service designer or health practitioner are coming in and you've got assumptions. So ask questions, listen, and ask about people's histories. Now, there's some few things there with respectful language. So I did find that QUT has a guide, and there's a hyperlink to it there. So it is on your website, which is a guide to respectful and inclusive language. Now, main thing to identify about this diversity amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is that you use plurals. Okay, peoples, plural, because there's more than one language group of people. Histories, plural, because histories have changed and emerged over time and can be contested. Perspectives, again, representing that there's different groups. When I go to the map of country, you'll see what I mean. And ways of being as in plural. So plurals are key. Capitalisation is critical. When you're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it's a capital I. For Indigenous, a capital E for elders, country, as it's got there, traditional custodians, and whatever the name of the country group is that you're looking at. So I'm up here on wonderful Gubbi Gubbi country. Now, in things to avoid is acronyms. Now, ATSI, as in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, that was one that was used a lot in previous years. Do not use acronyms. Just don't. And unacceptable terminology. I've taken this from the QUT guide that's really there. So it's Aboriginal people, not Aborigines, not blackfellas, coloured, native, primitive, any of these things here. As you can see, there's a notion there or mention about half caste or full blood. Now, there's a lot of concepts that have been used that are incredibly hurtful, where they look at the proportion of somebody's indigeneity. A person is an Aboriginal person, full stop. And it's not about dissecting people up into percentages. And words like tribe, hood, band, and clan. Most people will use the phrase language group, for example, and or language group is probably the safe one to use when you're talking about different countries. Now, the term black is quite contested, okay, in terms of different people, different Indigenous groups have different perspectives. It's often used to show solidarity on an international level. And there's been other phrases that have been used internationally that have grown. So Black people and people of colour is another one that's been used more frequently these days as well. Now, QUT recommends, and I've just gone from their recommendation, that you should only use the term Black when you're talking with Aboriginal with permission. Like, for example, I find that word offensive. That word's offensive to me, but for other people, it may not be. I certainly would react if someone said that to me or responded to me that way. So what is country? You've probably all heard of country. Rebecca did a great sort of acknowledgement of country where we came in, but not a lot of people really sort of get what it's all about. I've got a great project at the moment. We're just kicking off and we're talking about how country, the agency of country. Now, for Indigenous people, culture, nature, and land are all linked together. So people from different groups tend to find and draw energy from different places. So you can be a saltwater person, a desert person, a mountain person, a river person. And what you find is when you're on country in those spaces, that is where you feel connected, refreshed, fulfilled, and energy. That's why Aboriginal people look after country, because we are part of country. So Aboriginal spirituality is also totemitic, and each group tends to have responsibility or stewardship for their particular totem. So mine in my family is an emu. Indigenous communities have this connection to the land, and it is from that land and looking after that land and being part of that land, because the land replenishes, and it's important for Aboriginal people to look after the land. So it's like a symbiotic relationship, okay? So country includes everything. It's not just dirt, land, it's also water, air, trees, rocks, plants, animals, as well as special places within that land, such as sacred sites. Now, you probably have all seen something like this as a map of Europe. So as you can see there, you've got all these countries as you might know them as geographic groupings, and they're all different colors here, and you can see. And what you know with each of these countries is they've got different ways, different lifestyles, different ways of thinking, different languages, different ways of communicating, different mores, laws, protocols. Each of them is different. You'd find it very hard to compare a person from Spain, for example, to someone from Italy. Very, very different cultures, very different countries. So this is Australia. This is Australia's countries. This is Aboriginal countries. So exactly the same previously, different languages, different family groups, different ways of knowing and being and operating in the world. So this is the IATSIS map, and I think I have a link for it on the slides that I sent through to Rebecca. So prior to invasion, there was about 750 different countries. So when people talk about Aboriginal country, they're literally positioning and locating themselves. Aboriginal people will often, as I did, will introduce themselves by country. They'll say, I am so-and-so, or I am on such and such land. Absolutely critical. That positioning is really, really key. So when you're out and about in community, know what country, Aboriginal country, you're on. Okay, so there's this map. I did provide some links as well at the end of the slides for Rebecca that showed that had other ways that you can look at country, including different languages and words that you can learn. Indigenous languages in Australia have been highly decimated. It was interesting, last year was the year of Indigenous languages for the United Nations, and there's been some efforts to pull together languages they can from traditional custodians and speakers in certain areas, but a lot of languages have been lost. So when you look at this and you think about countries, just use it, I guess, as a shortcut to understanding Aboriginal country in Australia. Now, with Indigenous data, it's important that when you're collecting data or using data with your health service design, that you understand that Indigenous people have been over-researched. So if there's reluctance or pushback, that's why. Aboriginal people are one of the most over-researched populations in the world. And a lot of that data is never returned to Aboriginal people. It's never even accessible to Aboriginal people, and it definitely doesn't benefit Aboriginal people. So there's been a big global push in recent years called Indigenous data sovereignty, which means that when research is done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, they have ownership of their knowledge, of their learnings, of their wisdom. So this can include intellectual contribution. So when you're collecting data and you're working with Indigenous peoples, remember it's reciprocity. You have to give back this and provide access to information and access to whatever resources or artifacts that you create. After all, if you're using an ethics of care, you're doing it for and with Aboriginal people. It's not about the business, if you like. Professor Maggie Walters, I won't spend too much time on this one, but Professor Maggie Walters in Australia is an Aboriginal researcher at University of Tasmania who has written a lot in the area of data sovereignty. What she identifies as in particular is that data and research that talks, including health data, that talks about Indigenous peoples, frames Indigenous people as problematic. It unfairly compares Aboriginal people to the normal so-called Australian, which generally, typically is talking about white male Australians of European descent. So she has this incredible body of work that sits around this. And what happens is that we have to be careful in the data that we use and collect, and we have to be careful in how we frame Indigenous people, because it can lead to poor service design at the end of the day. So it's about being critical, that critical thinking. So when you're working with and for Indigenous people, which is what you will be doing, it's about you helping them to self-determine and elevate their own health outcomes. It's about Aboriginal people establishing what they want to achieve, their hopes, their aspirations, and you. Now, the key word in there is elevate as well. Don't assume that deficit perspective that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are vulnerable and have health inequalities. Okay, it's about taking this strengths approach, about elevating and leveraging what people currently have, what people are good at, what resources and capital they have with them. Self-determination is a really key part of that. Self-determination was a really big theory, particularly in the 70s, around political movements in Australia. That was what my grandparents were involved a lot in, was in the promotion and acceleration of self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, because legislation removed that. And it's absolutely key that Aboriginal people get to choose what they want to do in their life and are not treated in a paternalistic view, in that being told this is what is best for you and this is what our goals are. Some of you might recall last year when they talked about the closing of the gap, and which is the Australian strategy for closing the gap between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the dominant culture. and the Prime Minister actually came back and if you go and have a look at any of that material about it, they actually threw away the methodology and started with a new one. And what they started with was what I'm talking about here, where it's about Indigenous people self-determining and elevating their existing health, not this comparison and contrasting with a completely different group of people who've had privilege through and health privileges through their whole life and across generations. Self-determination is key because legislation prevented that. Indigenous people were, for example, like my mother's experience, grew up on a mission where everything was regulated and there was a manager. They'd ring the bell, you had to stand in a line. They'd ring the bell, you got rations of food. They'd ring the bell, you went to school. And this was adults, not just children. This was an entire group, an entire population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And that was into the 70s. So it wasn't that long ago. Okay. So self-determination is about that passing back of agency to people and allowing them to make their own decisions about it, about where they want to go in their lives. I talked a little bit there about that word elevate, which was about a strengths-based perspective. What that is focusing on what people are bringing to the table, okay? Not what they're missing. What they're missing is what's called a deficit perspective. And a deficit perspective assumes that you know more than they do, that they don't, that there's something that they're missing, a gap that they have that you have to fill or fix, and in a way blaming, okay? Now, a strengths-based approach, and I've got this one here I found for health and wellness, is really about, as you can see from the words on that particular graphic, is really about taking what people have and emphasizing and leveraging those positive cultural capital things. So, for example, an intervention or a service design that's focused on health would be emphasizing positive changes that people have made and positive elements as a part of that community has. In Indigenous cultures, as within culturally and linguistically diverse cultures, family is critical, and those connections and kinship relationships are incredibly key. Very much a sort of collectivist culture, if you like. So it's about building on those relationships. When you see advertising and promotions or design about Indigenous service products, it's not about an individual. It's actually about a community. There's talk about elders, there's talk about others within that group, and I guess many people involved within a family unit. So it's about building on those hopes and aspirations too. The deficit perspective would assume that there's no hopes and no aspirations, where in fact there is. So this is where that listening and that ethics of care comes into it. So obviously it's about building on strengths. The one I've got over here on the far side from the New South Wales Department of Education, I thought it had some just really nice quick summaries. You know, a strengths-based approach focuses on what individuals and communities can do. It's not about what they don't have. It's not about the inequalities that they've experienced. It acknowledges that people experience challenges and that they need support. It helps to inform guiding and learning. That's about how we learn. And it helps to promote confidence and capability. Now, one of the things I mentioned right at the beginning was understanding this difference between ethnicity and vulnerability. So ethnicity, if we sort of put a marketer's hat on, is a demographic characteristic. Okay, so people within any demographic group, if you just said women, there's more diversity and difference amongst the population of women. You can't just sort of go, say all women are the same or whatever. So just be aware that there are limits around or constraints around using demographics. Now, certain ethnicities, sometimes with the health literature, and this is the work of Maggie Walter, talk about being very careful that you don't represent a group of people who share an ethnic origin as all being vulnerable. You may have even noticed with the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, as well as other things, they'll say some Aboriginal people over the age of 55 are more vulnerable to health and compounded sort of ongoing diseases, and that is why they're vulnerable. But do not conflate vulnerability with ethnicity. You yourself have been vulnerable. I'm sure maybe during COVID-19 you felt vulnerable. So vulnerability is an experience that we have. It's a perception. It can be a short-term experience where we may feel scared at some point in time or vulnerable. We may not have resources about us, and things may resolve over time. But just connecting the two together can be different. So as an Aboriginal person, I don't feel vulnerable, but I know Aboriginal people that are and do. Every human feels vulnerable at some point. I'm just going to show you some really good examples. Now, I'm not thinking, yeah, it is going to work. So I'm just going to click a few buttons. So hopefully the sound will come through. Here we go. Let me know if it doesn't on the chat. This is a really good example, the Aboriginal quit line, and I'll just play it and listen to the phrasing and the terms that they use. Strengths-based, elevating, and focusing. It uses keywords like your mob or my mob, which is about talking about Aboriginal people as a part of their community. I'll just, hopefully you'll hear the
most important thing is supporting you.
Let me go back.
At Aboriginal Quitline Victoria, our vision for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is for us to be healthy and thriving.
We're here to do whatever we can to help our communities be strong and stay strong. Tobacco is one of the main substances that our communities have been using that takes away from our health, wellness and freedom.
See the keywords: health, wellness, freedom, our community, our community. So it's very much about building on those strengths.
As an addictive drug, tobacco can begin to take away freedom of choice. It takes away our choice of what we spend our money on. What we put in our body can impact our family and kids and how we spend our time. Addiction makes us feel like we need to keep smoking because when we try to stop, the withdrawals start. But there is hope. Support is available to help you quit smoking.
Keyword there is hope, and they talk about family and kids.
Tackling Indigenous smoking or TIS workers are deadly people in community who have stepped up to help our mob when they're ready to talk about quitting.
The word deadly is used as, for some people might think deadly as in dangerous, but it's actually deadly as in cool, awesome, amazing person. So in Aboriginal culture, that's why we use the word deadly. And the word mob was used as well. You can see there. So those sensitivities so that it is easily, it is relatable to the audience.
They can help you get the info you need and link you up with health professionals who understand our mob's needs.
They can also connect you with Aboriginal Quitline, an over-the-phone counselling service for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, provided by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members. Aboriginal Quitline counsellors are trained and experienced to guide and support Aboriginal people in preparing to quit, quitting and staying quit.
We're not here to pressure, shame or criticise. We want to make sure you're
Really key. We're not here to pressure, shame, or criticize. So it's about that idea of hope and instilling this strengths-based perspective. It's taking judgment away. Judgment is a part of that deficit framing.
You're informed and empowered to make your own choices. For us, the most important thing is supporting you.
If you want to find out more about quitting smoking, you can talk to an Aboriginal health or TIS worker at your local Aboriginal community centre or health service. You can also speak with an Aboriginal counsellor by calling Aboriginal Quitline on 13 78 48 from.
So you would have noticed in there they used the word, we're here to support you. So again, that idea of that ethics of care and that view that you're working with and for Aboriginal people. You're a facilitator, a co-designer, you're not coming in as the expert. Now they have
8 a.m. to 8 p.m.
I'll just skip forward to the next one. So this is these are some of this service in particular, as it said, is staffed by Aboriginal community members. Absolutely key. So it's not just this sort of umbrella service, it's actually led and staffed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So here's a great example of just a person talking as one of the Quitline counsellors.
Hi, my name is Jamara and I'm a bachelor Miramur woman and I'm an Aboriginal quit specialist. As an Aboriginal quit specialist, I love to hear your yarn and listen to your stories so we can work out the best way to quit. We speak to young ones, we speak to elders.
So keywords in there, we'd love to hear your yarn, which is a big part of that communication and that relaxed and engaging listening part of it too. Talk about elders as well, understanding how community connections come together. And you'll notice right at the beginning, she introduced herself and positioned herself by her country that she's from.
Everyone else in between. Smoking isn't part of our culture. So the best thing you can do for your health is quit smoking. Come on, you mob, give us a call. Call an Aboriginal quit specialist today.
So this service, I think from the inside out and top to bottom is a great example of it. I won't go through this one, but there is their site. If you have a look at their site as well and have a click through, there's a part that says how to support your mob to become smoke free. And it actually has, so this is a part of that empowerment. It actually has a list of questions. So if you're an Indigenous person and you've got someone in your family and your mob that you want to talk to about smoking, it actually has questions that you can ask them and ways that you can frame that discussion as well. So this is about helping people to help themselves and to empower people with the tools that they want and need in order to reach their goals and aspirations. Now, here is another one I'll put up as a great example. This came out during COVID last year, and it lined up with the release of, restart of the National Rugby League, NRL. So football's a very popular sport. A lot of Aboriginal people watch and Indigenous and lots of people, full stop, watch sport. So this was an idea of a number of episodes that were put together during that time to help people. And it focused, as it's got here, on 4 pieces of content, talking about connection to culture, staying healthy, managing stress, and keeping the mob safe. I'll just play the video a bit. Hopefully it's not, yeah, there's a bit further ahead. Let me go back.
Hey, brother!
T!
What you been doing, Eddie?
Where you been? What's going on?
I just been stopping home, you know, stopping home, keeping healthy.
It's been a difficult time, mate. Let's go and have a chat and let's come up with some good tips on ways that we can work through this isolation period. What are some of the things that you've done staying connected to culture to get you through this difficult time?
I've still had uni on during this time and I've had Indigenous studies, so it's been a good chance for me to, you know, reconnect to culture and get to learn more about our mob. I've been doing some painting as well and also, you know, been using technology, ringing up the mob, FaceTime and my nan and pop. It's been hard not being able to go and see them, but I know the best thing for me to do at the moment is to stay away from them, and I know that this isn't going to last forever. There's going to be a time where I can see them again. Still can reach out for support whenever we want. It's only a phone call away.
What are some of the things you'd say to young people to help get them through this difficult time?
You know, along with getting online and researching, you know, about your mob and where you're from and getting to know more about our culture, there's been so many courses online that our mob can do as well, so many language courses that our mob can be a part of. I think that's really important for our young people to connect in that way too.
How important is it that we look after our health at this time?
Well, I think that's the thing. Self-isolating doesn't mean that we should stop seeing our doctor. We need to be keeping our appointments, especially if you're 50 years or older or have an existing health condition. I think that's important for our mob. There's different ways we can do that now by, you know, telehealth or getting on a conference call with our doctors.
So T, it's been great to catch up. Some fantastic tips there for our mob on how they can stay connected.
So what you're noticing in all of these examples is Indigenous people talking to Indigenous people. That's that empowerment, that's that self-determination, and that's very much that strengths-based view and care ethics.
Connected and how they can use culture.
I'll jump to the next one. Here are some other examples I found online. So these are the New South Wales Health does some really cool stuff, as you'll see. I've used a lot of their examples. So these are some of their resources. So these were just that they were shared on social media that went out. So, but it uses language that Aboriginal people use. You've got an elder here, you've got Uncle Ivan Wellington. So in Aboriginal culture, the word uncle and auntie are used as signs of respect for elders. That's how you talk with people, uncle and auntie, and you may have heard that when you've been to Indigenous events. So even just the brand name used, keep our mob safe, that was the name of the campaign, and our mob needs to get vaccinated, and just the images that are used as well with Aboriginal people. This is a great one here. So phrases like don't be shamed, that's something that's commonly used amongst Aboriginal people. So it's using people's languages that they understand and phrases and turns of phrase in ways. And up here, this one was talking about sorry business, which is when a person passes away, and it's that process of mourning is called sorry business. So just to show you ways that it has been used to good effect. If you want to learn a little bit more, have a look at NITV, so the National Indigenous Television Station that is publicly available. I just popped it up there. That's just a screen from, you know, shot of the shows that they have. There's probably there's this one here, Aboriginal in Colour, which is a good documentary, and there's another one if you just sort of scroll along a bit further, that's called The Untold Story of Australia. So I suggest to have a look at those tonight, and that's a good way of building your own capacities and understandings and empathies, and about understanding some of those histories where people are coming from. And as I said, they're in plural, using them in plural. There is a book, and I've got the link there, of Success Stories in Indigenous Health, which has some other showcases there. A lot of the material that's out there, even if you watch NITV, you will see a large number of ads from government agencies, mostly health agencies. Watch them and see if you can identify, and they're all very much that strengths-based approach to addressing issues, and very much focusing on what people have and leveraging those strengths. So at that point, I think I'm just 2 minutes over. I'll stop sharing. But if there were any questions that people had.